Somewhere around 11 o'clock last week, I was lying in bed scrolling through someone's beach trip, doing the thing we all pretend we don't do, which is quietly measuring my life against a stranger's highlight reel, new patio furniture, a trip to Tulum, a car that definitely wasn't leased. And that little voice showed up, the one that says, "Everyone else is doing better than me." So I looked up the actual number. Not the Instagram number, the real one, the one economists use when they talk about the typical American household. $52,000 a year? What nobody tells you at brunch is that the person you're comparing yourself to is carrying over $9,000 in credit card debt and saving about 6 cents of every dollar they make. The highlight reel isn't hiding wealth. It's hiding the same math you're doing at your own kitchen table. This isn't really a story about one paycheck or one Instagram feed. And once you actually look at what normal means on paper, the whole comparison falls apart. Median household income in this country sits around $52,000 a year. Not the household making headlines, not the household with the Tulum trip, the one standing exactly in the middle, with half of all households earning less than that and half earning more. Run that $52,000 through rent, groceries, a car payment, insurance, gas, and a phone bill. And you're not left with a lifestyle. You're left with a budget that has maybe one bad month of cushion before something breaks it. That's the household everyone's quietly comparing themselves to on a Tuesday night, the one that looks fine from the outside and is one car repair away from a very different month. Here's the disconnect nobody's naming out loud. What you see online is curated from the top of the distribution, filtered through whatever the algorithm decided was worth showing you. What actually exists in the middle of the distribution is a household making do, not a household that's secretly winning and just being modest about it. I want to be clear about something before we go further. Nobody's failing here. $52,000 a year is small mostly because wages have not kept pace with what things actually cost. And everyone downstream of that gap is left doing math that used to be a lot more forgiving a generation ago. But here's the part that actually matters for you watching this. Knowing where the real middle sits changes the comparison entirely. You're looking at a group that is, statistically, in about the same amount of financial pressure you are, whether or not their captions admit it, and the number looks even tighter depending on where you live. $52,000 in a lower-cost part of the country stretches into something that resembles breathing room. The exact same $52,000 in a city with average rent pushing past $2,000 a month barely covers housing and food before a single other bill gets paid. The national median isn't one experience. It's an average sitting on top of some households that are managing fine and others that are underwater. And most of us have no idea which side of that line the people we're comparing ourselves to are actually standing on. There's a reason this particular number keeps getting used as a benchmark in every financial planning conversation, every retirement projection, every affordability calculator. It's the line everything else in this video gets measured against. So keep it in your head, $52,000, because everything we're about to look at, the debt, the savings, the retirement math, all of it gets built on top of that same starting number. Now, let's talk about the part that turns a tight budget into an actual trap. The average American household is carrying more than $9,000 in credit card debt. $9,000 sitting on a card charging somewhere north of 20% interest isn't a number that just sits there quietly. It grows. Pay only the minimum, and a big chunk of that payment goes straight to interest before it even touches what you originally spent. That's the kind of math that makes accountants cry. And it's not because anyone did anything reckless. Most of that debt isn't designer bags and impulsive vacations. It's a car repair that hit at the wrong time, a medical bill that showed up with no warning, a month where the paycheck and the bills just didn't line up. Debt like this usually isn't a spending problem. It's an emergency fund that never existed in the first place. Which brings us to the other half of this picture. The average savings rate in this country hovers around 6%. 6 cents of every dollar earned gets set aside, and the other 94 cents goes straight back out the door to rent, food, insurance, gas, childcare, all the fixed costs that don't care what your income actually is. And somehow, it gets worse. 6% isn't 6% of leftover money, it's 6% of income, period. Meaning the extra that's supposed to become an emergency fund or a retirement contribution barely exists most months. Monthly expenses have crept up faster than paychecks have, and a 6% savings rate is what's left after that gap has already taken its cut. Here's the part I want you to actually sit with. $9,000 in debt plus a 6% savings rate isn't two separate problems. It's one problem wearing two different outfits. The debt exists because there was never enough saved to absorb a surprise expense. And there's never enough saved because the debt is already eating a chunk of the paycheck every month in interest and minimum payments. Round and round it goes. Stretch that $9,000 balance out on minimum payments alone, and you can end up handing the bank more in interest than the original $9,000 ever cost you to spend, all while the balance barely moves for years. This happens whenever a balance grows faster each month than a minimum payment can chip away at it, which is exactly what the payment is designed to allow. If you're wondering how credit card companies get away with charging over 20% while your savings account pays you next to nothing, so is everyone else. That gap is basically the business model. The bank borrows your deposit for almost free and lends it back to someone else's balance at a rate that would make a loan shark blush. And the fact that this is just considered normal, banking tells you everything about who the system was actually built for. Now, take that same debt and that same 6% savings rate and stretch it across an entire working life. This is where it stops being uncomfortable and starts being genuinely dangerous, because this is where retirement enters the picture. The average Social Security check right now sits just over $2,000 a month. For a lot of households, that check functions as the entire retirement plan, in full, because there was never enough left over during the working years to build anything alongside it. Try running a real monthly budget on $2,000. Rent or a mortgage payment alone can eat more than half of it in a lot of the country. Add utilities, groceries, insurance, and whatever medical costs show up more often as you get older, and there's very little room left for anything resembling a life, let alone an emergency. Here's the detail that everyone misses at the time. A 6% savings rate on $52,000 a year is roughly $3,000 annually going toward the future. That's not nothing. But run the numbers on what it takes to eventually replace even a modest portion of a working income for 20 or 30 years of retirement, and $3,000 a year, started late and interrupted by debt payments, doesn't get you there. It gets you a Social Security check and very little else. This is why you'll see so many people well into their 60s and 70s still working, and not because they love the job. Social Security was designed to replace part of a working income, not all of it. It was never built to be the whole plan. But for a household that spent decades treating savings as whatever was left over after everything else got paid, part of a plan quietly became the entire plan, by default, not by choice. Part of why the gap gets this wide is that a real chunk of workers aren't even fully using the retirement account sitting right in front of them. Some jobs don't offer a 401k at all. Others offer one with a match nobody ever got around to signing up for because life was already full of more urgent decisions the month enrollment paperwork showed up. A 3% match left unclaimed for 10 straight years isn't a small oversight. It's thousands of dollars in free money that simply never got picked up, quietly compounding into a very different retirement for somebody else who happened to check the right box. I want to be direct about something here, because finance content loves to make this feel like a personal failure, and it isn't one. Nobody sits you down at 25 and walks you through what 6% now actually costs you at 70. You find this out decades later, usually right around the time it's hardest to fix, which makes this an information gap more than anything else. And it's the entire reason this video exists. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. I break down exactly this kind of thing every week. The real numbers behind the money stuff nobody explains properly. Stick around, because we're about to get into why this keeps happening generation after generation. And more importantly, what actually breaks the cycle? All right, so here's where things get a little uncomfortable because we need to talk about why this pattern repeats itself instead of quietly fixing itself over time. Part of this is genuinely structural. Wages for the typical household haven't kept pace with housing, healthcare, or childcare costs over the last few decades, so that $52,000 buys less life than it would have bought a generation ago. That part isn't a personal choice anyone made. But part of it is also that an entire industry has been built around making sure that 6% savings rate never quietly turns into 10. Buy now, pay later services split a purchase into 4 tidy payments so it barely registers as spending at all. Credit cards get marketed with points and cashback, framed as a reward for spending, not a cost. Every checkout page on your phone was engineered by very smart people, whose entire job is making the next purchase feel effortless, invisible, and slightly fun. Meanwhile, saving still takes you logging into a separate account, finding the transfer screen, and typing in a number, assuming you remember to do it before the money's already spent on something else. If you're wondering how that imbalance is even allowed, so is everyone else. The friction was never evenly distributed. It was pointed almost entirely at getting money out of your account faster. Then there's the comparison problem we opened with. Social media didn't invent lifestyle creep, but it gave it a highlight reel and a notifications bell. When the version of normal you're measuring yourself against online is actually the top slice of earners on their best day. Of course, the real median household, the one making $52,000 and carrying $9,000 in debt, feels like it's falling behind. It isn't falling behind anyone real. It's falling behind a filtered version of a person who's often in just as much financial pressure, minus the caption. It also doesn't help that personal finance was never actually taught as a real subject for most of us. You can graduate high school knowing the quadratic formula and still have no idea what an APR actually costs you, what a 401k match is worth, or why paying yourself first even matters. That knowledge gets picked up later in scattered pieces from a friend, a TikTok, or one very confusing conversation with a bank teller, usually well after the habits that determine the next 30 years were already forming. None of this is about willpower. Nobody wakes up choosing to save 6% instead of 10. It's what's left after a system engineered to encourage spending meets an income that was never quite built to keep pace with the cost of living. But this wasn't just about any one household anymore. Once you can see the pattern at this scale, you can also see exactly where to intervene in your own numbers, which is where we're going next. Okay, here's the actual roadmap. The part where average stops being your ceiling. None of this requires a finance degree. It requires a handful of decisions, made once, that quietly do the discipline for you every month after. First, attack the credit card debt before anything else if the interest rate is above your realistic investment return. A card charging over 20% is growing faster than almost any savings account or index fund can outpace, so extra dollars belong there first. List your balances from highest interest rate to lowest, and throw every spare dollar at the top of that list while paying minimums on the rest. Second, build a starter emergency fund of at least $1,000 before you do much else, even while paying down debt. This is the piece that was missing when that $9,000 first started accumulating. A small cushion means the next car repair goes on a debit card instead of a credit card, which is the difference between a bad week and a multi-year debt spiral. Third, once the high-interest debt is handled, automate your savings rate up from 6% toward 10%, then eventually 15. Set the transfer for the day your paycheck lands, before that money sits in checking long enough to feel spendable. You are not relying on willpower at 8 p.m. after a long day. You're relying on a transfer that already happened while you were still reasonable. Fourth, if your employer offers a 401k match, get to that match before anything else gets extra attention. That match is part of your compensation, sitting unclaimed if you're not contributing enough to receive it. Turning it down is turning down money that was already promised to you. Fifth, once you're above the 6% average, don't let a raise quietly disappear into a slightly nicer version of your current life. Bank half of every raise into savings before you increase spending at all. This is the single move that breaks lifestyle creep permanently, because you never get used to spending money you never let yourself see. Sixth, treat Social Security as a floor, not a plan. Whatever you can contribute beyond the average, a Roth, IRA, and HSA, if you have access to one, extra 401k contributions, is what actually determines whether retirement looks like the $2,000 a month scenario or something closer to a real income. Even an extra 1 or 2% of your paycheck, started now, compounds into a very different number 30 years from now. And last, stop measuring your progress against a feed engineered to make you feel behind. Measure it against your own numbers from 6 months ago. A household moving from 6% to 8% savings, with the highest interest debt shrinking every month, is doing better than most of what you're scrolling past at 11 p.m., regardless of what the caption says. And if you want one number to track above everything else on this list, track your savings rate specifically, not just your total balance. A balance can look fine sitting still, while a low savings rate quietly keeps you exactly where the average sits. A rising savings rate, even a slow one, is the one metric that guarantees you're moving away from average instead of just feeling like you are. None of this fixes the wage side of the equation overnight, but every piece of it is something you control starting with your very next paycheck, and that's the part nobody hands you a manual for. So, back to that phone at 11 o'clock. The beach trip was never the problem. The problem was measuring a real budget against a filtered one and assuming the gap was personal. It isn't. The median household in this country is carrying real debt, saving a thin margin, and heading toward a retirement that leans almost entirely on a check that was only ever supposed to be part of the plan. Nobody planned to end up here. It's just what happens when an entire system quietly makes spending effortless and saving an afterthought. You don't need to out-earn the average to beat it. You need to out-save it, one automated decision at a time, starting from wherever your number actually sits right now, not the number you wish you were starting from. This isn't unique to one household or one bad month. It's the pattern underneath almost everyone's finances right now, which means the fix is bigger than any one person too. If you want more of these breakdowns, the real numbers behind the money nobody explains properly, subscribe. I've got a lot more of this coming, and you deserve to know it now. Not the decade from now when the math gets a lot less forgiving,